If you're like me and you like to hide the clutter, then this video is definitely for you because I'm going to show you how to make leather or vinyl machine covers for your sewing machine. And I made these for both my domestic machine as well as my industrial Jukies. And I'm going to walk you through the process of how to measure your machine to get a cover that fits. And you all, these come together so simply. It's kind of ridiculous. But first, let's go ahead and talk about the different supplies that you're going to need. Now, for this, I recommend that you use leathers that are on the stiffer sides. And in this case, it's this Old West pull-up that I got from Weaver's Leather Supply. This is a 4 to 5 ounce, and this upper is a medium tempered basket weave embossed cow hide that I picked up from Tandy Leather. It was on clearance. And then, of course, you always have the option to add a handle here. Other materials that you can use do include things like vinyl, but you want to make sure, again, that you're not using a very soft vinyl because it's not going to hold its shape like this does. And we're not lining this, so you're going to have to make sure that it is going to be able to hold its own shape. Leather and vinyl doesn't fray, it's not going to come apart, so we don't have to worry about those seams here. Other supplies you'll need is a cutting knife, a rotary cutter, scissors, whatever your cutting method of choice is, as well as some double-sided tape and some clips to keep it all together. So let's go ahead and measure out our machine. The first measurement we want is the length of the entire machine. Now keep in mind, if you want to include your table, make sure that that's in your measurement. Or if you have a handle hanging off the side here, you'll need to include that as well. So I'm going to measure my machine, and that measures at about 18 3/4 inches. So I'm going to add seam allowance and a little bit of ease. So I'm going to make this overall length 20 inches. Let me measure the width, and you want to measure the widest part. I've got about 7.5 inches of width. So adding in about 1.5 inches of seam allowance and ease, that's going to equal 9.5 inches. And the last one is height. And mine's measuring at about 11 inches. Now we don't have a seam allowance on the bottom here, so we don't need to worry about that. We only need to worry about the seam allowance on the top. So keep that in mind. Let's go over to the cutting table. This is my top panel that measures 20 by 9.5 inches. And because I'm doing color blocking at a 50-50 ratio, I measure these out to be 20 by 6.5 inches. And I have that in both that yellow and the brown. And I'm going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance for those. And then the shorter side panels are measuring 9.5 by 6.5 inches each. For the handle, I cut a 5-inch by 1.5 inch piece, and I've gone ahead and sewn the sides just to add a little bit of stability there. The very first thing that we need to do is find the centers. So I'm just going to fold it in half, and then I'm going to grab my rotary cutter. I'm going to snip away just a teeny tiny bit at this corner here, so it gives me a little triangle cutout when it's open. And I'm going to do it on both sides of this top part. And now open that up and fold it the other direction so that we can get the halfway points on the shorter edge as well. And make sure that you're doing teeny tiny snips. Keep it within the seam allowance. Now I'm going to draw a line all the way across from one of those little triangle snips to the other, so that way I can find the center part of my top here, so that way I can attach the actual handle and it's not going to look crazy lopsided or anything. So there's the halfway point there, and I'm lining up the top and bottom notches here. and there's the exact middle. So that's the point that I'm going to aim for with my handle. Now grab your handle and fold it in half so that way you can find the middle point here that you're going to line up. And then I'm going to just grab my double-sided tape and I'm going to stick it to both sides of this handle. It's going to really help me keep this thing in place while I'm sewing it without the use of any needles or pins. So go ahead and peel that off and then stick it on, lining up that center point. So now that I'm looking at that, I can see that one of my handle sides is just a little too high. So I brought out my marker to line up those notches that I made, and I'm just going to unstick the one side and adjust it. And there we go. To attach, I'll sew along the edge here and then about 1/2 inch up there. Now you can always add rivets if you'd like to add some extra support, but I really don't think it's needed. Okay, so first I'm going to go ahead and measure out a 1/2 inch from the edge, the short edge of this handle, and I'm going to draw a line there for my stitch line. And there's that side. I'm going to do it on the other side as well. Just mark out that 1/2 inch. Hang on, you all, my ruler's a little unruly here. This one's much better. So there's my 1/2 inch marks. And so we're going to sew there, and then I'm going to sew closer to that edge at about a 1/4 inch or 1/8 of an inch. So now you can see that that handle is attached. The next thing I'm going to do is grab my lighter so that way I can melt the ends of my threads and just kind of smash them down so that way they don't pull out at all. It's just a little trick to tidy up those thread ends and to make sure that even with a little bit of stress that your threads aren't going to start unraveling or popping out. Let's go ahead and put this top panel to a side and sew together the rest of our panels. So the bottom of my panels are going to be this brown and the top is this yellow that's going to overlap the brown. So grab your double-sided tape. This is a 1/4 inch size tape. It's a 1/4 inch wide. And put it on the wrong side of that top piece. I'm just going to cut that off. And then for this bottom piece, I'm going to draw my 1/2 inch. We're going to call it a seam allowance, but we're basically going to draw that 1/2 inch line across the top, and that's going to help us stick that upper piece on there. Okay, so this is going to be our guiding line right here. Remove that tape and then line up that very bottom edge of your upper piece to that lower piece where we drew that line. And then we're going to sew that at a 1/4 inch from the edge. So let's go ahead and do this to all of our pieces. So that way we can take it to the sewing machine at one time. It's just easier to do all the prep and then sewing at one time. So here's all of my panels. Let's take it to the sewing machine. So I'm going to sew from that very corner, or I'm sorry, the bottom of the edge here at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I actually recommend that you backstitch, and to make a cleaner look in the front, pull on that thread in the back and it'll help pull that top thread through, so that way you can just snip it and melt that down and it'll give you a cleaner look. So here's the moment of truth. We need to size up these panels and make adjustments. So grab your side panel and we're going to line up where these two meet, just so we have that really nice look all the way around. And you can see here
that mine is just a little bit off on both the top and the bottom. So I'm just going to mark that off here because I'm going to trim it off. And really, this is just a measuring issue. From when I first did it, apparently my measurements were a little bit off. So I'm just going to go ahead and correct it on both sides. I'll make those marks. This one fits a little better. So I'll draw the line from there to there, and I'll just snip it right on off with that rotary cutter. So now that it's all trimmed up, when I line up my pieces again, it's a much better fit. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my little clips. I'm going to clip these sides together. I like to start clipping them together at that very center where I want to make sure that those pieces align for a really clean look all around the cover. And then I'll move to both of the ends here. Now that we've got that done, we need to sew down the sides here using your seam allowance. I'm going to do mine at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but if you measured for a 1/2 inch seam allowance, use that. Next, we need to remove the bulk from the seam allowances where we're going to be attaching it, or attaching that upper piece, right? So I am going to shave off about 1/2 inch down, going to nothing at the very edge of my stitch line here. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to attach the top without having a ton of bulk. Now the reason I did it at a 1/2 inch is because I'm going to attach the top with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so now grab your pieces and I want you to fold them, try to crease them out, push that seam allowance out so that way you can kind of fold them and give it some shaping so that it does take on that more rectangular shape. If you're using a veg tan or something that takes the water well, you can also spray it with water and do this and then let it dry, and it'll take on some really beautiful shaping. So that's a nice little trick that I like to use and something that I go back to and do with this one. Now let's attach our very last panel. So go ahead and lay it down right side up and then put the rest of your pieces and line them up the way we did the other parts. And you want your right sides facing each other so that we can sew this seam allowance up the side as well. So go ahead and put your clips in, and you're going to want to put them in on both sides so that way you have a little ring. So scooch the leather out the way, line up those panels, and get to sewing. And here it is all sewn up. Now we need to attach the top, and it's going to be attached like this with the right sides together, but first we need to do something to this top panel. So one of the things that I like to do is draw in my stitch line on the top panel that gets connected to everything else. And that's just because it can get a little shifty. And if I can see my line, it helps me keep things lined up. I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so that's what I'm drawing in here with my friction pen. And I'm going to draw in that line on all sides of this panel. Now that I have my seam allowances drawn in, I'm going to cut out the corners within that seam allowance. So I'll have a little 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch cutout on all 4 corners. And what this is going to do is it's going to help reduce the amounts of bulk that we have in those corners. Also, when you're sewing them, it can get a little tricky lining those up. So by simply removing this, it's really going to make the entire process better. Now line up that top panel to the side panels And you're going to make sure that the right sides are facing each other. So just go ahead and pin and then sew across that top. And when you're done, you have something that looks like this. And you see when we press that out, looks beautiful. So I'm just going to press that the same way that we did the other seams. And now I'm going to match up my next seam, which is that shorter edge. So just wrangle your leather around and line up those edges. Put your binder clips in and sew this edge as well. And we're going to do that all the way around the top of this panel. So this is what the final project looks like. And if you're feeling spicy, you can remove some additional bulk from those corners. But at this point, I'm going to leave that in and I'm just going to flip my entire project inside out. Now this can be the scary part. It's going to feel like you're abusing your leather, but don't worry about it. Just go ahead and flip it out so that the right side is, well, on the right side. Poke those corners out as much as you can. I get my fingers right onto that seam allowance and I push from that point so that way I can just get as crisp a corner as possible here. Sometimes I'll even pull out a chopstick so that I can push out that corner and it'll look sharper. So just do your best at this point. And when it's done, this is what it looks like. Now I'm going to go back in and spray the inside of this with water so that I can let it dry and it'll keep its shape a little more. And when it's all done, this is what it looks like when it's on your machine. You have your beautiful boxed look to it, the color blocked sides all the way around. I mean, it's really something to be proud of. And what's nice about mine right here is that it also fits my Bernina. And so I'm just going to slip that right on over. And there you go.